Matches, you recently rebranded as matchesfashion.com. You got an amazing investment in Matches IT infrastructure. You're putting so much of the emphasis on e-retail. Tell me about sort of how the landscape of retail is changing. Huge questions to begin with.
Okay, yes. Well, you know, I suppose the reality is that a large part of our business is online. You know, you mentioned 75% of our business is online now. And really the journey was for us to uniform the platform. So we have a bricks and mortar business, that's where our history is, it's where our DNA is. And it was about uniforming that platform with our digital platform. And it's really, for us, it's about how we can make the physical experience more digital and how we can make the digital experience more physical. So how we can uniform that all around one thing, which is about the customer choice, how the customer wants to interact with us, how they want to have a conversation with us, and how they want to see the product.
And I think when Tom talks about the customer, we're talking about the customer as someone who engages with us, then not necessarily a shopper. We have lots of, for example, in the physical space, we have lots of fashion students who'll come in and touch and feel, and we want fashion students to be able to come onto the site and actually gain the same kind of experience. So those two platforms are just how we're talking to our customer in general, and that customer is a very broad demographic of people and not always a shopper.
How did you keep sort of your understanding of your customer? Because you must have been so used to the kind of the shoppers walking into the London store, and now you shipped, is it like 190 countries? Is it really hard to kind of know that customer when it's so diverse?
I think it's easier than ever to know the customer. I mean, when we started, we were definitely, obviously, bricks and mortar retailers, but our customer was always super international. So they were traveling a lot.
Sure.
And we'd have people who were coming in very loyal, but came to us when they were over from Australia or from the US or wherever they lived. So we always had that connection to the customer. So now being able to talk to them when they're at home gives us access around the clock. And there's so much information you can get from, even from Instagram, there's so much information you can retrieve from your customer, and there's so many platforms that you can talk to them on, that the information you can get is key. I mean, Tom talks about a lot about personalization, and that's about creating digitally the same intimacy that you have in store. And when you do that, your customer will hopefully, in our case we feel that's true, trust us.
We have to keep the DNA of what we are as a business, and keep that very strong message globally without being over-influenced by the buys. So I think that's probably one of the interesting challenges we have.
And how do you do that?
I think the taste level is key, but I mean the information that we can get, for example, around people's sizing in different geographic territories is super interesting. But when, I mean, to your question, when we try and stay in touch with the whole audience, we still have to behave in a really intuitive way. However much information we have to hand, the intuition is key for the buying team. I mean, what they see on market. And actually we talk a lot to journalists when we're out about their take on things. That won't necessarily influence our buy, but it's interesting to get as many opinions as we can. It's a very collaborative, I think buying is a very collaborative piece of work, and you're also appealing to an aspirational customer who's just coming up, who might not necessarily be able to afford luxury, and so we need to include them in all our decision making, but also very much focus on the customer who is the luxury customer who's out there with disposable income to spend on those pieces, because that's the dream. But the dream is there, but there's also this huge demographic of people who are working towards that dream, and those are also our customers.
It's interesting, one of the frustrations that I have with journalism in fashions, I feel like there are a lot of these kind of perhaps cliches, perhaps not, about different audiences and different territories, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about the complexity of kind of
complexity.
Exactly, because I think there's these tired ideas of a kind of, you know, logo mad, slightly sort of uninformed Asian shopper, and then a really savvy London shopper.
It's also interesting when you're looking at, for example, that Chinese customer, to think about their history and how they arrived at fashion and how new they are to it in many ways. So also, and how fast they've learnt about it. So they're almost, they want to be right where it's at, and caught up on that educational curve. They've got it, and then they've decided that they're going in their own direction. They've been able to form their own opinions really quickly.
15 years ago, a brand would have to wait for it to be picked up by a department store. They'd have to wait 6 months for that department store to show the product. Often the department store would turn around and say, oh, it's not quite new, and it's a little, we need to see how you'll develop. So it's really challenging for a brand to become successful in a very short period of time, or to be noticed. And now with social media, with digital, with things like Instagram, there's an immediacy behind it. There's an immediacy of noise in a market.
I imagine when you started buying, a lot of the focus was purely on the product. If the designer had made something great and you thought it would sell, you would buy it. Now when you're thinking about a new label, or even doing your buy with your existing designers that you work with, do you ever think about, okay, they've got a great digital reach, or they're really good at selling themselves, so we'll buy from them because of that? Is it more than the product now?
No, I think it can be, but the product has to come first.
The brand starts with the product, doesn't it? And if the product isn't good, the product isn't good.
And are they smarter than ever? Tom, you keep mentioning this this huge amount of information, and I think that has just changed the way people shop. They expect to know everything about the brands they're buying now. Is it even kind of more of a challenge to seduce a shopper now because they know everything?
I think it's so exciting. I think the information is kind of a question about trying to manage the level of information to keep sort of a really strong view about what you're trying to achieve, and not be over-influenced by the level of information. Sometimes there's too much. That is a big thing these days. If you compare it to what it was like being a retailer 15 years ago or 10 years ago, is the amount of information and how connected we have to become as a business. We're not a buying department and a marketing department anymore. We're a buying and e-commerce, editorial department. Everyone has to be so connected, not just on a seasonal basis, but on a daily and even an hourly basis about what's happening in a market. And that puts huge, I see these poor buying teams, that go out to market. They're out there now, they'll be out there for another 2 or 3 weeks. They come back. I'm constantly sending them emails on a daily basis saying, what's happening here? How do we do this one?
Is it ever harder to enjoy it because you kind of don't have time to stop, I guess, and just think?
I think you have to have a certain personality to do it. I kind of love the noise. Sometimes I kind of feel like, God, just put me into a dark room for 10 minutes so I can switch off. But you
need a certain amount of stamina for it, I think. And mental stamina as well is really important to keep up. But you have to have that kind of personality where you constantly crave newness and you constantly want to be challenged, and you have to be incredibly mentally agile, I think, to work in the fashion industry.
We talked about the present, but I want to talk about you as characters and as people. Tell me about when you were younger. Was fashion, retail, something you aspired to do? I obviously know about your background, but I'm interested.
What have you read?
What were you like growing up? What were your ambitions? What were you interested in as kind of young people?
I think for me, my ambition was actually to be, God, this sounds a little bit control free, to be a creature of my own destiny. That's really what I always wanted to do. And I don't think for me there was a specific thing that I wanted to do, but it was more about making decisions and knowing that some of those decisions would be bad ones, but actually they were my decisions, and I was responsible for them. So when I was younger, I went to New York quite a lot in my late teens, and I think that was an incredibly inspiring time. It was sort of 30 years ago, 30 odd years ago, and it was an incredible amount of energy there. Very different from London, at the time. There was a huge difference, and I think it was very inspiring to see that level of energy, that passion, the enthusiasm, the excitement. Interesting retailers. Charivari was. Is that how you say it?
Charivari.
How do you say it? Amazing store in New York that used to exist.
And I just had very glamorous mother, very glamorous stepmother who really loved clothes, almost to the extent that I think, actually looking back, it was quite literal what they wore in the 70s. I think back and they were like caricatures of that era. But I loved clothes and I loved fashion, and when I look back, I loved it more than I realized at the time, because I was I customized my uniform. I must have looked like a complete freak, but I thought I looked great. And I always would, I'd cycle to school in great big platform wedges, and I was very naughty and rebellious and loved all the things that at that time that were really, for me, Debbie Harry and Mark Bolan and all those things were influences on how I dressed and how I wore and how much eyeliner I used and how I flicked my hair. All those things were just always influencing me, and they were actually way too important to me for a girl who should have been studying and paying more attention. And then that really ended up with me just being, looking at Vogue continually, saving up to buy things from Betty Jackson from Quorum at age 15, and just, you know, really literally scrounging. Yeah, scrounging and just making sure I had those things because they were so important to me. But I didn't think that it would form a career of any sort at all, which it just did.
It's really interesting because there's two very different sides there. One is the kind of the pragmatism and this interest in the shopper and the consumer and the pace of retail, and the other is the fantasy and the enjoyment of clothes and the kind of romance of it all.
But that's probably how we've sort of, we kind of, to a certain extent, it's kind of how we manage our working lives today. You know, it's kind of around those sort of channels. You know, obviously Ruth is, you know, totally focused on the product, the consumer engagement with it, the brands that we work with. You know, I'm more focused on the sort of the marketing, the customer side, etc. So they're kind of, you know, it's how we've sort of divided our time because those are really the passions that we both have.
Maybe it's the skills rather than the responsibilities, like you both bring different things to the table.
It's not really responsibilities anymore. You know, I think that, you know, you have to relinquish as much control as you possibly can as a business grows. Your challenges become very different. You know, gone are the days of 25 years ago where we were opening boxes and selling the product. We can't do that now. As much as I might love to sell, I can't do that. So, you know, we have to surround ourselves with brilliant, incredibly capable people, far brighter and far more capable than we are in lots of areas. And, you know, we're just sort of sitting there and being the sort of reason behind everything. So not making those decisions, but involved in those decisions, being the sort of the sounding block for it. And equally, as much as we are for them, we are for each other as well, if that makes sense.
It's interesting because you keep referring to yourself, and I've read it in past interviews, this is you, Tom, you've said, and you've said it several times here, you said that you're a bit of a control freak, but then you also kind of talked about that period where you did realise you have to relinquish control. And tell me, just kind of from a narrative perspective, when you realised that you needed to do that, when the business got to a point where you thought, hang on, I'm going to need to change.
I think you realise it all the time, Lou. You know, I think that, you know, the reality is that as your business grows, that you have to release control. And, you know, that can go back to the day that suddenly I stopped spending, you know, every weekend in the store, or the day that I would stop, you know, we've done that throughout our history. I think, you know, probably last year, we had to relinquish so much control because, you know, the reality was, you know, we grew by 130% last year. You know, it's quite a meteoric growth, not a small base. We recruited nearly 200 people in a year. You know, that in itself is a challenging thing to immerse those people into the business and understand it. So I think that probably the last 2 years we've had to relinquish an awful lot. And, you know, I'm actually very grateful because we've brought in incredible people who have really been taken on that mantle incredibly well, haven't they?
I think one thing that Tom's always been very good at, and yes, I think he is a control freak, but I'll come to that in a minute, but one thing he's always been very good at is working with and collaborating with really talented people and hiring them as well. And I think that's a great strength of his, and giving and empowering them, that's the key, letting them do their job. But he has, and here's the control freak part, this uncanny instinct to, he can, for example, he can walk in a store and he can find the one piece that has the wrong price. He can look at a set of figures and that people have been working on for days, and he can find
it's
the
a
one
slight exaggeration,
floor.
But yeah,
he does this. People
nice.
will tell you.
I like the flashy.
And then, you know, he can look at the e-commerce figures straight away, and he can find it's uncanny.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it's not entirely true.
Because everybody talks about it at work. It's like, oh God, he's going to, you know, it takes him like 2 minutes and he'll just find it. It's like a kind of radar that you have for that.
Is it quite emotionally challenging when it's something, as you said, that you were kind of once unpacking boxes yourself?
You know, no, I think that I love it. I mean, I think it's fantastic when we have. There was one point I look back a number of years ago where we had a number of people who worked for us who went off and they all became the buyers of big department stores. And, you know, you're always sorry to lose people.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's quite a proud moment when you think actually every department store in London is being bought by people that we work with and we nurtured from the start of their career. It's quite amazing.
I'm way too emotional about everything, and I need to learn to be less emotionally involved in everything, because it just, I don't know why, but I just am. That's, I have to learn I try all the time to be less, but it matters so much to me. So.
Do you feel like a real sense of responsibility when you're working with a designer and you're aware that your feedback probably more than a fashion critic's feedback, is going to impact how they work and how they design. Yeah.
I think it's like everything. There's so much noise around a designer. If there's too many opinions,
Yeah.
how do they actually form what they
Yeah.
really stay true to what they should do?
That's so true.
And I think that's one of the challenges they face. They can't listen to, the American department store to ask to this. I mean, how many people can you listen to?
Yeah.
So I think that, I can understand that must be challenging for them.
I think any feedback you give designers at whatever stage has to come way after their research stage, way after their creativity stage, and then it can only be things around the pricing structure or the category or what your customer needs. Does your customer need skirts for £300 that are shaped like this? That's the kind of feedback we'll give them, not you need to redesign your collection.
Do you think you'll always keep the physical shops?
No doubt in my mind. I think that, the physical is in our DNA. It's how we started a business, and I think it's a really important part. I think the format will change dramatically. The way that we present the physical presence will be very, very different in a year or two's time to what it is now. And it will, but it's still part of our journey. It's very, very important to us.